Welcome back, everyone. These divisions that I outlined in the previous video in the end are going to hamper Islamic expansion. But for the moment, as far as our story is concerned, they remain remarkably successful. However, this period from about 650 to 750 also is going to witness several Muslim defeats that are going to define the limits of Islamic influence and Islamic political control. So even though Heraclius, as you'll remember from last week, had withdrawn to Anatolia, had withdrawn to modern Turkey, you can see the pink on your map here, even though he'd retreated from Syria and Palestine in the face of the power of the Islamic army, that didn't mean that the Islamic Empire was finished with Byzantium. So Muawiyah and Uthman had built the first Islamic navy, and this navy had defeated the Byzantine navy and had laid the foundations for a Muslim attack on Constantinople. We ask, how is it that the Muslims from Arabia, from a desert land, were able to work out how to sail and train a navy that could defeat the Byzantine Empire? Again, just as we saw with the conquest of Egypt, the reason is that much of this navy is built, run, and staffed by Monophysite Christians who prefer the physical tolerance and financial penalties they endured under Islam to the persecution they endured under the Byzantines. So it's kind of an interesting corollary. Would you rather be tolerated but have fiscal penalties, or would you rather have no fiscal penalties but have to live in persecution? I guess when I put it in those terms, it seems like most people would choose the way the Monophysites chose. In 717 then, with the foundations for this expedition having been laid through the construction of a navy, the Muslim expedition laid siege to the city. Laid siege to the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Remember, however, that historically speaking, Islamic armies are not great at siege warfare. Their mobility is devastating out in the open plain, the open battlefield, but fighting sieges against walled cities, that wasn't really a part of their military culture. And so, the army crosses over to Europe and besieges Constantinople on the landward side. Hopefully you can see me showing you this with my pointer. So the idea of the siege is that you have the Muslim army over here trapping the Byzantine army in the city, and then you have the Islamic navy that's controlling the straits of the Bosporus here, and they're going to starve the city into submission. However, the blockading fleet, the Islamic Navy, is destroyed by a new invention that the Byzantines use at this time. This is the development of Greek fire, a very powerful fiery substance that even burned on water. And I love this manuscript depiction that I use in so many of my classes that show them just hosing this fire at their enemies. And so now this means that you have the Byzantine navy sailing up and down here, the Muslims can't do anything about it, and is resupplying the city of Constantinople. So you're not starving anyone into submission, but the people who are starving are the Muslim army that's trapped on this side. And they endure a miserable winter in which we have accounts of disease, we have accounts of the soldiers eating their horses, accounts of the soldiers eating their dead comrades in order to survive. So in the spring, the Muslim commander decides that enough is enough, and they get on the remaining ships, head back home. On the way back home, they take incoming fire from a volcano, and only 5 ships survive. And this is an important moment in the history of the Middle Ages, that the Byzantine Empire survives at this time. It means that for the next several centuries, Constantinople is going to be preserved from further attacks. It means that the Byzantine Empire, which had retreated to sort of the area here, modern-day Turkey and modern-day Greece and the Balkans, it means that it will survive in this post-Islam form. And so it sets an eastern edge for Islamic conquest. It means that Islam is going to influence the history of the Middle East and Syria considerably, but that the Byzantine Empire and its connection back to ancient Rome will continue to influence modern-day Turkey and the rest of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. And so this establishes a bulwark for Eastern Europe against further Islamic expansion. It establishes the extent of the Byzantine Empire as one of the three civilizations, one of the three cultures that will seek to replace or to maintain the achievements of ancient Rome. Meanwhile, other Islamic armies continued to expand to the west. In 708, they had conquered Carthage and Tangier, and they controlled all the territory of the old Roman province of North Africa. And then, as you can see from the map here, this section in yellow, they began to expand inland, and they began to convert the indigenous African, Berber, and Moorish tribes. Then, in 711, they invaded across the Straits of Gibraltar into the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain. The Visigoths had never succeeded in establishing a dynastic kingship. Remember that the way succession was worked out in this kingdom was that the new king was elected rather than becoming, so they were chosen by a council of free men. This meant that the transition period between rulers was always violent and uncertain. Or always is probably a strong word, but a lot of the time. You didn't know who was going to become king. You had two candidates. They would fight with one another no matter who the free men chose. And this is what's happened in 711. Two sides that have come to hate one another so much that one of them makes an alliance with Muslims in North Africa. And so these Muslim allies come over, led by a Berber, so a native North African, named Tariq ibn Zayed. The Muslim armies are victorious, but then of course they refuse to leave, and they take over almost the whole kingdom and push further north through the peninsula. The few remaining Visigoths who refused to accept this defeat were led by a man named Pelayo, and they retreated to the northernmost part of Spain, where it's wet and mountainous, and you can see this very little pink strip here. So under Pelayo, these Visigoths retreat here to northern Spain. Eventually, about 10 years later, they had made themselves annoying enough that the Muslims sent an army up there with the idea of, okay, we're going to put these people finally out of business. And so they sent negotiators up the mountain, where once they had cornered Pelayo and his band of followers. And they emphasized how small their numbers were. They're said to have described them as 30 barbarians perched upon a rock. And they told Pelayo that it was pointless to keep fighting. Nevertheless, Pelayo refused to submit, and somehow, probably taking advantage of this mountainous terrain that you can see pictured here, they won a surprising victory. A victory at the Battle of Covadonga. And this victory was seen as a Christian miracle. Was seen as a Christian miracle, but at the time it in no way really affected Muslim control of the rest of Spain. And the Muslims basically decided, okay, it's pretty hard to pin these people down in the mountains. We're going to leave them up there. They're not really challenging our control of the rest of Spain. We'll leave them to their own devices. Nevertheless, it was seen by Christians as miraculous. It was seen as a reward of the persistence of Pelayo. And here you can see a special statue that was raised at the site. And it provided a cultural rallying cry for Christian Spaniards who are now living under the political rule of Muslim leaders. It was a rallying cry to remember that Spain had been a Christian land, to appeal to the goal of restoring a unified Visigothic kingdom. And this cultural memory will have important consequences. And so this is kind of a really interesting part of history, the dynamic between an event that happens that has no important impact immediately. It doesn't change a whole lot immediately. But in the long term, the way that this event is remembered by people will have a huge effect on the future history of the region. So memory, how events are remembered, is really important to the study of cultures and the development of civilizations. It's another important reason for studying history. For the moment, however, Pelayo and his followers are basically a band of outlaws in the mountains, and they do not prevent Islamic armies from expanding further, starting to move further north across the Pyrenees and into the Kingdom of the Franks. Now, the Kingdom of the Franks, like the Kingdom of the Visigoths, was also suffering from a period of weakness and instability at this time. And this weakness and instability stemmed from their traditional practice of dividing their inheritance among their heirs. This had meant that the successors of Clovis had got poorer and poorer as each time you had a new generation, they would divide their lands. And it meant that over generations, the more powerful figures in the empire, or the more powerful figures in this region of the Franks, were those nobles who could maintain a solid core of land over successive generations. By the 8th century, one of these nobles, whose name was Charles Martel, Martel means hammer, so we've gone from pillaging warrior to hammer. That might sound like it's getting a little more civilized, but perhaps not an awful lot. Charles Martel had acquired the title Mayor of the Palace. The Mayor of the Palace was basically the commander of the royal armies. And Charles, to his immense credit, recognized the threat of Muslim Spain. He had seen raiding parties starting to come across the Pyrenees, and he recognized that before long there would be a large enough raiding party that would go deep enough into France that he would be required to raise an army and to defend the kingdom. And so he began to prepare. Now, we all think of knights and armies of the Middle Ages, and we think of horseback cavalry. Charles actually didn't have access to cavalry at the time. He didn't have access to cavalry, but he learned how Muslim tactics were based on trying to draw their enemies out of position and then by attacking them and then pretending to run away, and their enemies would be drawn out of formation and defeated in that way. And so Charles trained the largest force that he could to recruit, to be loyal and obedient and disciplined in fighting the battle. In 732, the raid that Charles had envisioned occurred. And the Muslim raiders were overconfident. At this point, when you've come so far and you've conquered so much, who can really blame them? But they allowed Charles to choose his site where the battle will be fought. Basically, the Muslim army is making its way through France and making their way towards the city of Tours, which was a wealthy city because it was a center of religious pilgrimage. And then they see Charles's armies waiting for them across their path at the top of a hill. And so Charles draws up his army in a phalanx under some trees to make it difficult for the Muslims on their horses. And basically this phalanx just took this position and held off wave after wave of Islamic cavalry attacks. These are the attacks that we saw last week had shattered the empires of Persia and Byzantium. But here, this much poorer, much smaller Frankish army held firm. And at the crucial point in the battle, Charles sent scouts to attack the Muslim wagon train. The Muslims were confused. The Franks used this opportunity to attack. In this attack, the Muslim commander fell, was killed, and the Muslim army retired back across the Pyrenees into Spain. Now, some people have suggested or tried to downplay the importance of the Battle of Tours by saying that this was just a raid into Spain. But what did we learn last time? We learned that the significance of these events is that these Islamic conquests always begin as raids. And what the Muslim generals have been so good at doing is seizing the initiative when they come face to face with the enemy. And so it's not at all unfair to say that without this victory, you would certainly have seen the expansion of Islamic rule further into Western Europe. And so these Muslim defeats at Tours, at Covadonga, and at Constantinople are very important because they set the boundaries of Muslim conquest and rule for most of the rest of this course. In many ways, these great territorial conquests of the Muslims show that they can be the successors of the Roman Empire. You look at this map, the green and the yellow, so much of that is a restoration of the union of these territories that we saw under Rome. But at the same time, we're going to see a failure to break into Europe that shows there are limitations to their efforts to succeed uh, the spread of the